Good evening, Oslo! Hey! Someone's had beers already, including me. You've just been listening, in case anyone wondered. They didn't, apart from one person. That was Ned's Atomic Dustbin, a band from the 90s, grungy English band with a song called Kill Your Television, which I thought was appropriate. So I have a talk all about the history of TV, how it works, if anyone remembers old-fashioned TV screens that weren't flat, and explain how that's moved to our phones, how we compress video, and how you're actually using your phone right now to do stuff. I've also gone for the cheesiest looking things that I could do in PowerPoint that make it look like someone's wedding video from the 1980s done on VHS. So that's why you have page curls, which no one should ever use, right? So why the hell did I get interested in television? When did I get interested in television? I'll go on to the fact that I worked for TV companies, and I thought it's because I kind of watched a bit of TV, and then I worked for the TV companies. It turned out my parents were feeding me books. This is one of them. This is the Ladybird book of how television works. This is from 1968, indeed. So bloody old, older than me, just. Right, so only just older than me. This is an old enough book. I found these when I was clearing out the house last year, parents' house. And what I found out was, in this book, it mentions colour TV is coming. Right, so the lucky bit is that I also had something called Television Magic. And that was a much later book that came out in 1978. And that was published by Marks and Spencer. The food store from Britain had books, apparently. You know that because it's got St. Michael written at the top, and everyone knows from the UK, St. Michael means it must be Marks and Spencer's. This mentions we still had an old-fashioned black and white version of TV, but it did understand we had colour TV and explained it. So that was cool. So, how did I end up working in TV? Well, I watched a lot of TV, serious amounts of TV. So things like, we had our first ever breakfast TV channel. Like there was no TV before 10 in the morning. Suddenly there was TV at 6. I got up early, massively early, and sat with my back against a radiator in my living room to keep warm because it was January or something like that. So I could be there for 6 o'clock to watch the first ever television at 6 in the morning. So I was clearly going to end up working in TV. And the thing I actually did when I was at university, you had work placements, and that is me on the top of BBC Television Centre, which used to be a famous thing because it was on lots of programmes. They used to do lots of programmes from it, as in they shot it and you could see where it was and it had the big writing on it. You weren't allowed on that roof, but we kind of went through a door that you're not meant to go through and got on the roof. And I was doing computer graphics for generally a local election programme at the same time that the room next to me was editing the Rome Euros. So that was 1990, I think. And then, because I'd worked in TV, and TV is very, very incestuous and nepotistic, I could then go to Sky News. And then I got a job at GMTV with people I'd worked with at the BBC. And I did things for Sky Sports. And when Sky News got even more modern and stopped looking like an American channel and kind of had European design graphics. So I was there at Sky TV doing weather maps, election graphics, football results, football clocks that we used to put in outside broadcast trucks and go to the football grounds. So if anyone knows football, there's 2 teams in Scotland called Celtic v Rangers. It's quite a grudge match. It's actually Catholics v Protestants on a football pitch. It's the only place I went to where the truck had caging round it to protect it from the fans. And when they had a foul in the penalty area, I watched the director do a super slow-mo and said, "Look, you can see his teeth come out." and there were teeth coming out of this defender's mouth, and it actually broke his jaw, and they said, we can't obviously show that, though, because that would be a bit grim. So yeah, so I used to do stuff like that. So I started learning all the stuff about TV, how you format it, how you send it around a building, what size a picture is in TV, all the kind of things you have to know to do computer graphics. But we're going to do a history lesson. That was just a history of me. So BC, before colour, right? So when did television kind of get made? Well, EMI, which you probably know as a record company, was called Electrical and Musical Industries. So the only reason it sold records was so it could sell record players. And it also did some of the first TV stuff. I was chatting to someone in the hallway from the US who said, of course it's disputed that you invented TV. Yeah, right, okay. No, the British invented TV, John Logie Baird. He did a mechanical format. He actually had a completely mechanical way of recording television, right? No electronic valves, tubes, and stuff like that. Whereas EMI Marconi came in, and they worked out how to do it with actual phosphors and electron guns and all sorts of stuff. So, and that was really cool. So they alternated. This is the bizarre bit, is the BBC was struggling to work out, should we do Marconi's or should we do Baird? And they said, 1 week we'll broadcast with the Baird system, and the next week we'll broadcast with the Marconi system. We'll keep alternating every week. Yeah, madness, right? Which meant you probably had to have 2 different TVs that could do 2 different things, right? So it makes no sense. And very quickly, the mechanical Baird system was so unreliable, they ditched it. And they went with the EMI Marconi version. And that was 405 lines. That was broadcast for 48 years. It only shut down in 1985. In comparison, the modern system that the whole of Europe runs on, PAL, that, in the UK, only lasted 43 years before digital television shut it down. So the EMI Marconi system lasted longer than the replacement that was colour, which is kind of freaky. So the weird bit here is, how did these electronic cameras work? So they'd won, it wasn't the mechanical, so how were they going to work? And there were no semiconductors. So we didn't have what are called CCDs, charge-coupled devices, that we have in our modern phones and in our digital cameras. So the light's going to go through a camera lens, and it goes onto this photosensitive plate called a mosaic. And they could use cesium. And cesium, when light hit it, got all excited and gave off electrons. Not quite enough to kind of get a signal down an electric wire. So what you did was you have a beam of electrons hitting that mosaic going along and exciting the few electrons that had come out even more, so that now you had a signal. Now, you may, some people may know that the way that the old-fashioned CRTs screens worked is there's a beam of electrons, and magnets make the electrons move down the screen. And the magnets are moving really fast to pull the beam across and switch it and move it over here. Because electrons are charged, and therefore they're magnetic, so they can be moved around by magnets. But what I didn't know until I did this talk was that's how the cameras did it. They just did it in reverse. They had a beam going through. So they were scanning 50 times a second in the UK, and they release electrons. So a picture describes this much better. And of course, a 1968 picture from the Lady Bird book of television has an attractive female presenter talking to the camera. And there's a blow-up of it, which shows exactly how it's kind of working. So what we have is the image coming through. Of course, it's upside down. That's kind of how cameras work. They have upside-down images. And this electric gun is sending electrons over here to hit the screen. And these magnets are moving that electron beam and making it go sweep, sweep, sweep all the way through. And then the signal comes off and goes to an amplifier. And you get your black and white TV picture. you'll notice in this whole scheme is you clearly have lines, 405, and everyone says, right, I know that when I have an image on my computer, it's so many pixels wide and so many pixels high. There is no wide because it's a continuous beam. And in fact, the original black and white TVs are just phosphor. You can actually, there is no dots across. There's only a time that it goes across. So actually, it has a higher resolution, possibly, nominally, than our modern screens because it doesn't have pixels. It's really freaky. So you're thinking, how are we going to do color? And you're going, right. So we're going to get something that reacts better to red and green and blue. How should you do this? And the answer is, you don't do anything like that. What you do is you put color filters, because you only need brightness, not color. So what you do is you split the incoming light into red, green, and blue, and you send it into the 3 television tubes. So there's now 3 things in every camera. You've trebled the cost and complexity of each camera, because now it's got 3 tubes, one doing red, one doing green, one doing blue. And they come in and do exactly what the brightness was on the black and white TV, but one of them's only doing red, green, one's doing blue. And you look at a camera like that thinking, oh, there's 3 things on there, or 4 things, that's probably the red. No. Unbelievably, they didn't have lenses that could easily zoom in and out. They swiveled an entire lens round to get a different focus length so they could zoom in on someone in the studio. That's what these are. And even in outside broadcasts, they still have things like this to do long shots across a football pitch and things like that and go really close. But that's not what we use today. We use something called a charge-coupled device. Right. But they have a similar concept. They only do monochrome. So they're not going to do red, green, and blue. So what you do is you do filters. And you do filters on top of that CCD. And that allows you to split it into red, green, and blue. Here's the irony. The camera company, Kodak, invented, in fact, this guy, Bryce Bayer, it's still known as the Bayer filter used in most cameras, invented a way of doing digital cameras really well. And then Kodak didn't make them, because that would stop it selling film. Yeah. Kodak don't exist anymore, really, right, as a company, but they still delivered this to the world, which is amazing. The other interesting bit is you have more green pixels than red and blue, right? It's something to do with human vision. And the basic thing is, when you go outside as a human being, there's a lot of green. And over our time in evolution, we've desensitized to some of the green, because there's too much of it, and we want to concentrate on the red and the blue. And that's why they have to capture more green to allow us to get that information through. So this is all how our eyes work. You have red cones, blue cones, you have green something else's, I can't remember what they're called. Rods, well done. Good prompting. And the eye's really perceiving luminance over those colors, and that's why you actually have to wait how you sample your video coming in. With a professional camera that you'd use for TV, they don't do this funny layer thing. They actually have 3 CCDs, filters, and a prism doing red, green, and blue, just like the old camera tubes, because you get a much more accurate color picture. So how do red, blue, and green combine? When you look at them, it's this thing that I'm wearing, right? This is the color bars. And what you can see here is that if you have 100% red, green, and blue, you get the white bar on the far end. It's meant to be white. It's kind of grayish on this, but just think it's white. Right? Red and green produces the yellow. Red and blue produces magenta. That one. And, we'll get it right, green and blue is producing the cyan over here. Right? You'll notice, everyone goes, oh, I know about magenta, cyan, and blue, because that's what's in my printer. The interesting bit is, when you transmit pictures, you transmit in red, green, and blue, but when light falls on documents and then reflects up, you want it to be in cyan, yellow, and magenta. And that's why print printers work in CMYK and TV works in RGB because it's a reflective light on a print and it's transmissive on broadcasts. And the 8-bit colors in studios, because you do have the concept of like 0 to 255 for each pixel of red, green, and blue, they actually range from 16 to 235. Right? They never go peak white, and they never go pure black. Right? And the reason for that is, in the old days, there was analog TV signals wandering the building. And the problem with 0 black is that that's 0 volts, maybe, if all your equipment has the same earth. If it doesn't, you're going to send negative volts into something, and it's probably going to get upset. So you do not go super black, and you do not go peak white. And if you ever notice, quite often in news studios or television programs that are live, when they look at their scripts, they might be on pink paper or yellow paper. They are not normally on white, because if a light hits it and does full reflection of white, you get peak white and you can take out equipment in the old days. So everyone prints on yellow and pink in order to get around it. It's very weird. So that's how you can combine all these, and this is exactly how the cathode ray tube works. So this is the big thing in the corner that was huge, big cabinet. Really tough screen on the front. When I was a kid, the school was opposite a shop that rented televisions. Does anyone remember you didn't own a television? You rented it? Yeah. It's hard to believe, but you paid someone so much a month to rent it, and then if it went wrong, they came and fixed it. Right. I saw old ones, and someone had a sledgehammer trying to smash the screen, and it took quite a lot of blows to get that screen smashed. These were really tough things. So what happens here is those signals that have been nicely captured by the TV company, sent down to you. You have 3 electron guns firing off. They all go through something called a shadow mask. So this was all invented by RCA in the US. And they go through the mask, but they're at slightly different angles, so they hit red, green, and blue phosphors on your TV screen. So the electron excites this little bit of phosphor and puts out blue, or it excites this, puts out red, excites this, puts out green. And this mask stopped it bleeding into the extra dots. So if this gun is slightly out, it didn't light the next dot by accident. So, and that's how they made sure it worked. And although you had nominally so many lines in a picture, you actually showed less than that to give time for the magnets to get the guns back to the top, right? Because it takes time to move those electrons, because they are firing out really fast. So yes, so this is where the tinfoil hat people claim they were being irradiated by monitors, right? Right. The interesting bit is there were huge. I was actually at the BBC when they did a survey of people from the BBC, especially including women who'd had babies, to check that the monitors had not affected their health. Now, at home, you're sat at quite a distance away, and physics says the strength of a signal or radiation would be a cube as you move away from the screen. So at home, no chance. The same thing happens with your microwave. Anything that leaks, as soon as you're like a meter away, it's nothing. Right? It's less than your mobile phone in your pocket. That's why your mobile phone in your pocket is more dangerous than a microwave, right? Because they're both putting out radiation, and the mobile phone is probably beating your microwave in the corner of the room. The point with people who worked in television is they sat really close to monitors, and those monitors were much more powerful than a normal home one. That's why they were doing it, and they still found no effects. Now, the interesting thing about CRTs, you could abuse them for your pleasure. Right. Did anyone ever get a magnet and put it near the... Yes. Right. Remember I said that magnets control where the electrons go? You could put a magnet on your CRT and move the colors around. If you're old enough, you remember that your monitors, computer monitors, used to eventually go a bit funny, and you pressed a button called the degauss button, and the whole monitor went, like generally made a noise as it did it, and that was it taking all the magnetism away from that mask that was on front of the screen. So, there was a game for the BBC microcomputer. It was fantastic, but it was hard to play. And this game was written by a bloody physicist. So he accurately did gravity, and he did things like, this is a weight, and as you move, that weight drags you round and causes you to slew. If anyone's driven a trailer that's heavy, they'll know what happens with your car. You've got to be a bit careful about this. And he decided that one of the ways to make the levels harder was to reverse gravity. So now, instead of you being pulled down, you were pulled up. So you were meant to learn how to cope with a reverse of gravity. But at the time, the monitors that people used with BBC Micros were these, cub monitors. And they were square. So you could put them upside down. So the way I played that game was to put it upside down, and then gravity was the right way up. Right? And that's how I cheated at that game. If you played it long enough, the colours had already changed when you put it upside down. That lovely blue had turned to magenta, because now the beams were just in the wrong place and hitting the wrong phosphors. And then you turned it back up, and this was a monitor that was borrowed from my dad's school. Borrowed. Therefore, you shouldn't break it. And you turned it back the right way after 2 hours of playing, and the colours kind of stayed a bit odd for about a day before they went back to normal. So don't do that. Right. So the mask is a bit of an issue, because this was not helped by there being a mask in the way, because that gets magnetized as well. Also, remember that mask, you saw a picture of it, you're blocking out half the available light, because that mask is covering loads of bits of the screen. So Sony also wanted to bypass the patents for that shadow mask technology. And they created something called Sony Trinitron. So they were getting around this license from RCA. And they did a 3-in-1 electron gun. And they had vertical stripes. So if you were in the era of CRTs, everyone wanted a Trinitron or a Diamondtron, because they were really good. And the way they worked is they did vertical wires down with the phosphor in the middle. So they did this. They didn't have dots. They just had strips of phosphor doing the color. And that made much more light come out of the tube. So the pictures were all vivid. The blacks were more black. Vertical wires are a bit of an issue when your monitor gets really big, because they start wobbling around. So there are little horizontal tungsten wires that go across, that hold the vertical wires in place. You have no idea they're there until someone says, there's vertical wires, that hold this in place. And then you look at the screen and go, yes, there are. I can never not see these ever again. Right? So it's really annoying when they tell you that. And that's all the monitors in broadcast studios were Trinitrons at that point. And you could see these wires even on a small one, because they were trying to keep it really good. And the technology to do this color won an Emmy Award for technology, right? So it won a Creative Arts Award, and that's why Sony ruled in television for years. I mean, a long time. And did the best TVs, and is why Sony is still all the equipment in TV stations almost, because of that. That's why they had such a strong hold about it. So, that was CRTs. Now I've got to talk about how flat screens work. I am going to ignore plasma screens. Right, plasma was a dead end. Right? Plasma screens they could give you a really good color, but you could turn your heating off. And if you wanted breakfast, you could watch a plasma screen for a few hours and throw an egg at it, and it would cook on the screen. So those screens got really hot, and you actually were warned not to go near and touch them, because that was hot plasma gases in a screen, and they weren't cheap to make because of the technology. So fortunately, LCDs came along. So But to talk about LCDs, we need to talk about polarization. Does anyone know how polarization works at all? Ooh, this is interesting. I was meant to get a skipping rope to do this, but I think I would still fail to do the skipping rope. Imagine a skipping rope that you've attached to a tree, and you can flick it. It will start making nice little hoopy waves, like that. That's a polarized wave, because it's only vertical. Now, you could try and do it horizontally, but gravity will not help you, and it will sag, right? You'll find it really hard to do it. And so imagine that. If you had a piece of wood with a vertical slot, and you were really good, you can get that rope to carry on waggling in the slot, and it doesn't affect it. If you put the wood horizontally, and the slot's like that, that wave can't get through. That is how polarization works. So, if you have sunglasses that are polarized, that means it cuts out half the light, pretty much, because the light's coming at all angles, and it's getting rid of one of the polarizations. The interesting bit is your GPS and your phone also do polarization, and if you're very unlucky, when you put your sunglasses on that are polarized, your screens go blank on your GPS and phone because they actually block everything coming off the phone or the GPS. So this is what LCDs rely on, this idea of polarization. So you thought this was mad. These electron beams, magnets, spinning it around, doing phosphors, that's crazy shit, right? That's old-fashioned. I can't believe how it works. The weird thing is, LCDs are mechanical. They're electromechanical, but they're mechanical. So what happens is, a backlight shines through two polarized filters. It makes the light polarized in one direction. It then goes through something called liquid crystal. That's the LC bit of the display. That liquid crystal is a liquid with crystals in it that when you apply a current, the crystals move. So every pixel on your screen that you see on an LCD that shows you red, green, and blue has moving parts on every single pixel. And it's moving 50 times a second. And it's moving in degrees to create brightnesses as well. So every bit of your screen is constantly moving on an LCD screen. That's what you're watching. So you can see that what happens is these pixels get untwisted, allows the light pass through. If they are twisted, they block it. So you get blacks and you get whites. You then put, oddly enough, red, green, and blue kind of filters on top of every little pixel, and it does the red, green, and blue for you. So that's cool. Has anyone ever got a stuck pixel on an LCD? Has anyone gone on Googled it and they say, rub it, right? When you're rubbing it, if it unsticks, that's the correct word, you have mechanically moved the crystal to allow it to twist and untwist. That's what you're doing when you're going to your screen. If it doesn't do that, the crystals are really jammed or the electric circuits failed on that pixel. That's what's happened. So that, to me, is way more complicated than 3 electron guns and a bit of phosphor, right? That's very impressive that that works at all. There's a more modern version of it, OLED, or modern version of flat screens. This is not liquid crystal. This is how people think their phones work, because they think it just emits light. So now you've got rid of the mechanicalness, and you're just back to using phosphors, or light-emitting compounds. So now your OLED phone is just emitting light, no polarization required. That's cool. Still uses color filters to do, it's still probably only luminescing bright white, and then the filters allow the colors to get through. But this is much more like the old-fashioned TVs with phosphor. The phosphor lights up, it emits light, you put it through filters, it looks really cool. And that's why you get much better blacks, much better colors, because it's emitting light instead of like half the light disappearing instantly. In that polarization, you have already halved the light from the light behind the screen in order to make it work. And you might go, yes, I understand. Green, red, blue, green, red, blue, green, pixels. Until you get that, and this, and these OLED screens, especially Samsung, when they did their Super AMOLED screens, aren't even red, green, and blue. They've started doing extra greens. So the pixels aren't the real pixels. So when they say it's dots per inch, is it really dots per inch? It's not real dots per inch. It's kind of a fictitious dots per inch. So it's really weird how they kind of fool us into thinking these are all going to be just red, green, and blue. No, they kind of take that eye thing and put more green in as well. So it is quite weird how they do it. If you can get, because that is actually a zoomed in photo of a real screen, of what it looks like when you look at it in detail compared to what you think it should look like, which is more like that. So that's how we get our displays. So we still have a red, green, and blue in the camera. We've got charge coupled devices now. They're managing to suck all the color data down. It's sent to us. We now get OLED screens. That's great. But we need to talk about fields and frames. This is corny and comes from the fact that I cycle. Here's a field that I cycled down, probably not on this bike, because this bike went into a car and is slightly crippled. So was I at the end of this, because it was quite painful to go over the bonnet of a car and do that much damage to your bike. But fields and frames are something we talk about in video. So a frame is a complete, full image. And fields are every alternating line in an image. So this is what was called interlacing. If you were old enough again, you had interlaced modes on computers and non-interlaced modes. The other thing you would have noticed, if anyone had VCRs and you paused the tape, you would have had two fields shown to you at the same time. And if it was fast moving, the people were going, because they weren't actually the same image. They were slightly out. So it's really freaky. But the point is, if you record video like that, you can do a lower frequency and still get the movement looking good. And the eye just takes it all away. The eye just goes, yeah, I can understand how that works. I'll just fill in the gaps and make it work. US television, AC power is 60 hertz, NTSC is 60 fields. UK and EU, our power is 50 hertz. We have 25 frames and 50 fields, and I still haven't edited this slide from London where I got told that's the wrong number. It's 50 fields. So, unbelievably, the TV standards in the US and Europe are based on the frequency of the voltage of the power to your house, because it makes it easier to make the TVs. Of course, before we had TV and power electricity, we had film, and of course, they're 24 frames with no fields, which is interesting. That's the film going through a camera. Not only that, I don't know if you knew this, but 1/3 of the time you're in the cinema, the screen is blank. So you should go into the cinema and ask for 1/3 of your money back, because they didn't show you anything for 1/3 of the time. Someone said, I don't understand why it would, because they have to move the film, and you would see it move. So they have to hide it, move it to the next frame, open it, show you the picture, close it, move it up, open it, close it, move it up. That's what you're getting in the cinema, a film doing this, to show whole pictures. So, it's important to know that I had a go at the US about the claim they invented TV, but the US did get there first with color, and they did it badly, right? So NTSC stands for something, if you're not American, and it stands for never twice the same color, right? So if you ever watched American comedies like Cheers, I remember watching Cheers, the colors are really weird, like oversaturated, the reds are a bit odd, it's yellow's blurry, who knows why it was like that. Interestingly, the person who released this album isn't American because they spelt the word colour correctly. Right? For those from the US, if there's any US people still left here, clearly stands for never twice the same colour without the U. The wrong way of spelling colour. Okay. So basically, they got there first, and they didn't manage to get colour correction natively in the signal to make sure every TV set could do this right colour. The guy I was talking to when I was just walking down the stairs into the arena said, oh, the way you got the colour was to adjust the knob and hit the back side of the set. So you basically, in TV programs in the US, you twiddle with your TV to get it back to the right colour occasionally, which is like, wow. Whereas PAL, being European type standard, we spent ages discussing it. Right? But we got a better thing out at the end of it. The other thing to note about PAL, is anyone here from France? Anyone here from France? Because they have a standard called SECAM, S-E-C-A-M. Here's the secret. SECAM is just a way of broadcasting the signal, because all the studio equipment is still PAL. But they wanted to defend Thomson making TV sets, so they invented a different standard so they could have their own, so that they could preserve their own industry making TVs. Right. It's hard to believe of the French, isn't it? So NTSC is strictly actually 29.97 frames per second. I kind of tried to put in 30, and then I met Kendall Miller, who said, no, it's not, it's 29.97. Because he knows quite a lot about this as well. So here we have scan lines. You know I talked about there being lines, but not really pixels at that point. So that was 486 scan lines. If you actually think about it, 640 by 480 at 60 hertz is VGA. That's why VGA is that size. It's based on NTSC because the Americans were doing the computers. PAL is 25 frames a second, 576 scan lines. Again, remember I said there's a time it takes for the beam to go back up to the top. And that's why you've got this drop in the number of lines. And what they worked out is, you know what we can put in those extra lines that you never see? We can put in the subtitles. So that's how subtitles work. And if your set was a bit shit, and the picture was going in, you started seeing white blobs at the top of the screen moving around. That was the data for the teletext and the subtitle pages being shown to you as part of the picture. So it was used for all that kind of stuff, which was quite a cool way of dealing with it. And every frame has these two fields for alternating lines, which is why you get the dancing man on a VHS. It's why when you capture images from video, there's an option called deinterlace in your image processing, so you can get rid of that kind of jarring effect. Now, the interesting bit here is, how do you convert films to video? Because films are 24 frames, US is 25, and we're 30. Wow. So, unbelievably, for the American market, you have to do weird shit. Right. Because it's so close, 24 frames is far enough away that you start doing this. You start saying, right, there's the original film frames, and you start repeating frames in the video. And they're not frames, they're fields. So you're actually combining a bit of that and a bit of that to make this one in NTSC. And this is how they transform, and you end up with this, being how films get transformed for America. And that's how they cope with the fact that, how do you blend 24 frames into 30? Now, you notice that 24 is awfully close to 25, right, in Europe. That makes it even harder, right, because it's really close. So how do you deal with that? It's really easy. You run it at 25 frames a second, and all our DVDs are 4% shorter. Genuinely, you can look at DVDs, and they have a shorter runtime in Europe than in the US because we just played them quicker. Right? No mucking about. That's genuinely true. Because it's the easiest way of solving this problem. Right? Quite scary. So that was kind of films and TV transmission. But we started going digital. So the digital world's coming. And MPEG is a thing you may have heard of. It's the Moving Pictures Expert Group. That's what MPEG stands for. It builds on work from, does anyone know what it was built from? Because there was another group that has the word expert group in it, and pictures. Yeah, Joint Pictures Expert Group is JPEG. So JPEG was how you crunched down single images. And then they went, what about moving ones? Let's extend what JPEG did to moving. You know, it's quite sensible. So JPEG goes, this bit of an image is pretty much the same. You know, these 10 pixels, 16 pixels are pretty much the same red. If we say they are the same red, we can save a lot of space. So our image can go down in size. That's pretty much what JPEG does. It says, right, it does it more complicated than that. It's, you know, and it does things like, this is the same for so many pixels and all sorts of things to crunch it down. But it's trying to make a mosaic of a picture, like little tiles, and the more tiles you put in, the smaller they get, the harder it is to see that there's these tiles in there. And MPEG is the analogous thing for video. However, it's moving. So what you do, you don't only say, I will do a JPEG of every frame. In fact, there is something called MJPEG, which is every frame has been JPEG'd, and it's full. That's really good for editing, because that allows you to edit at any point in the video. But it takes up a huge amount of space. You would not get that on a DVD, and one of the aims was to get DVDs. You knew how much space you could put on it. It was the same as a CD. It's about 700 meg of data. You have a 2-hour movie. How do you get that on a DVD? That's what MPEG was really about at the time. So you're actually not only looking for similarities in the same frame, you're trying to look for areas that haven't changed between frames. And you say, right, most of this is the same. So I could probably use what I've already got and just do the bits that have changed. And that's how MPEG starts to do it. MPEG 1 was kind of VHS quality. So that was for CD-ROMs, because they were trying to do it on that. They'd done a lot more work for MPEG 2, and they got the quality up. So you get 2 megabits to 4 megabits kind of data structure. That is what all the original digital satellite did. All the original digital terrestrial TV uses about 2 to 3 megabits per channel. If it's a news program, and remember, news program has newsreader, sat still, tiny little bit moving over there. They tend to crunch them lower and give them less bandwidth, which means every time they go to someone speaking outside, which they did on an election broadcast that I saw on Sky News, where Labour's candidate for being our Prime Minister was in a school with lots of flags fluttering in the background, it went really blocky. Because the flags were moving, everything was moving, it's really hard to compress that stuff. So you've got to be careful. So here is the mathsy bit. Remember when you did maths and said, no one will ever use discrete cosine transformations or Fourier transforms? No, it's what it all needs. All of our video relies on it. All of our music relies on this kind of stuff. It's trying to see differences, crunch it down, subsample it. They even aren't really doing RGB all the time. They're actually doing it in luminance, chrominance, and color difference, because you can get more compression because the human eye looks at brightness more than anything else. So there's all sorts of clever stuff. Interestingly, the DVD or the MPEG standards, they only say, if you are given this file, you should be able to play it. So they say a decoder should be able to play this. What they don't say is how clever can you encode it. So you can make much better encoders and specialize in getting really good compression and good encoders, and then you deliver something which, according to the MPEG 2 spec, can play. Because the MPEG 2 spec says you should be able to play this. Unless it's the Matrix DVD on early DVD players, where it didn't play at all, because it was too complex and the processors couldn't handle it. So they were MPEG 2 spec compatible, but it was too much for those devices. So it's really nice because it's a really interesting way of doing a specification. You specify how to decode it, and then you allow someone to make really clever encoders. and the encoders cost money, and then the decoding is cheap and can be put in any device. And that's what they license at, like, 50 cents per device. Every DVD-ROM, every DVD gets a little bit of money given away to MPEG for licenses, and a bit of money to Sony, and a bit of money to Philips, who invented optical disc technology. Which is why Philips still exists as a company when they ran out of the 2 pence per cassette tape they used to charge everyone. Right, because they invented the cassette tape, and they did it on every cassette tape, gave Philips 1 or 2p. So how does it actually work? So this is where you get things called group of pictures. This will become clear why I'm discussing this as well, because I will talk about how a satellite dish tunes, and this gets really important. So you start with something called an iframe. An iframe is a complete picture. I'm making it hard for the cameraman because I promised him I was only going to be walking over there, and I've walked over here. So you start with an iframe, and then you go, here's the changes that have been made going forward. There might be about 12 frames between the two. So you've only got, in the whole 1 second, you've only got 3 full pictures. And everything else is either this is new or this has changed. So this has moved, and I'm going to show you where it's moved to. And in fact, it doesn't even say, here's the bit that's moved completely. It just says, this bit of the screen that you had over here has moved, and you don't need to redraw it. Just use the data you already had. So it's really clever stuff. And the point is, when they're mastering DVDs, they go backwards and forwards through it and get the best encoding possible. If they're rubbish, they do a live encoding like a broadcast, and it looks like crap, which is why you get reviews of, this is a really good DVD version or a really good Blu-ray version, and some people go, this is abysmal, what were they doing? Because they didn't spend the time to multipass encode it. It's really hard to demo this. You used to see it when there were satellite signals that failed, or terrestrial signals. You had thunderstorms and the data got corrupted, and you'd see blockiness and certain things happen. And I said, it's so annoying that I can't show you this. And then I was watching, there's something in the UK called BBC iPlayer, right? So BBC iPlayer used to have a desktop version. Right? So there was a Windows version and a Mac version, and they decided, no one uses real things anymore. They only use mobile phones or iPads, so we're only going to support mobile devices. Fortunately, they also had already said, we're not going to support Linux. So a load of people went off and wrote something that can download any bit of video off BBC and put it in an MPEG file on your local disk to solve the Linux problem, which has solved my, it doesn't work on a Surface Go anymore. So instead of installing an Android subsystem just so I can run a fake Android phone to watch BBC, I just download the content anyway now. So you can download it, and I put it on an SD card. And then while I was watching it, I tried to do something else on that SD card. SD cards aren't very great at multiple access. So this caused it to not get the data properly off the SD card. And I saw wonderful things. Not her. But it's inside museums, so this is still on iPlayer, I think. BBC Global News, it's their copyright. I've done the tiniest bit. I'm not doing the audio, and I'm only doing it to demonstrate this failure in encoding. So this is a classic bit of newsreader-type footage of how you could see how only certain bits get sent down. So we're going to watch this woman being interviewed. It's all working fine. I'm stupidly now starting to access the SD card at some point, and it's losing its buffer of data. That's her eyes, right? I think that's worth seeing again. Oops. So think about it. The only bit moving when he was doing that interview was her blinking her eyes, and that's why that little iframe, backward and forward, only shows her eyes. And that is telling you how it got encoded. It's also showing you how it's pixelated, and it's tried to create this using that kind of JPEG, these are similar colors, and it hasn't resolved it because it hasn't got enough information. So this becomes important. Who has digital satellite TVs? God, hardly anyone, just you. So, 2, there you are. When you tune a channel on a satellite TV, it takes about a second to change channel. Okay? It's just one of those things. Even digital terrestrial takes a bit of time. So the interesting thing about this dish actually works, even though it looks awful. It's owned by my landlord, not by me. And I don't use it, interestingly. But this thing in the middle is called the low noise block down converter. Everyone calls it an LNB. This is a quad LNB because it can take 4 wires in it and tune multiple signals at the same time. What they actually do is use polarization. So when a satellite signal is coming down from the satellite, it sends a load of channels doing this, and it also sends a load of channels like that. This thing can block it out and only get the vertical polarization or the horizontal polarization. You get twice the number of channels on the same frequency. That's why you do it. And satellites are expensive things to send up and expensive things to manage. That's why you do this. So it amplifies this very weak signal. In the original days, by the way, down this wire from your satellite receiver, it is sending a voltage to power all this. This is a powered device powered by your set-top box. In the old days, they actually had a magnet to do polarization that physically moved inside the satellite dish. And there was a mechanical component switching in order to do polarization. Now they can do it electronically, which is faster. So the set-top box says, hey, I want horizontal vertical. I then get a signal from the dish. That signal is analog. It's really important that, you know, we all have digital phones that do 5G and 4G. The original signal is analog. That's how it works. Then it has to be tuned and the digitization ripped out of it. So it's got to do this analog tuning. For every given frequency, you can have 12 channels on a satellite. It's called a multiplex. Digital terrestrial, it's about 6. They send them together in one block. It has to then get the single channel out, extract it, and start decoding the MPEG. What this means is the time taken to tune a channel on a TV is I select polarization, probably about that much of a second. I then do the analog tuning. Can tune quite fast. Circuitry's got really good at that. Mobile phones have guaranteed that. I then have to look inside all the data for all 12 channels, work out which bit of that data is actually that channel, and its subtitles, and its now and next information, and does it have audio tracks that are different, so you can have audio described or different languages. Has to do all of that. Rips that out. Then it's getting the transport stream from the multiplex, and then it goes to the MPEG decoder chip and says, start decoding. It probably takes maybe half a second to get to the iframes that it knows, because it's got to go to the 2 iframes, work out the forward and back, and finally gets to work. And you end up with 0.56 seconds to change a channel. It actually takes slightly longer generally, but that's quite amazing. It's doing a lot to change that channel, it turns out. So it's quite cool. And that is my Geek Out on television and video. And it's nighttime. So the TV is going to turn off, which in the old days, your TV set used to do that and gradually disappear. So thank you for not watching the Line Breakers and joining me for this techie talk.